The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. The same second Camille Voss grabbed the back of Danny Marquez's dress and pulled with all her strength. The fabric tore from shoulder to waist, and the sound of ripping silk cut through the ballroom louder than the music. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then the whispers started, and Danny stood frozen in the middle of the grandest hotel in the city, half exposed, holding the torn pieces of her uniform against her chest, while 200 guests turned to stare. Danny had arrived at the Grandeur Hotel 4 hours earlier with a simple goal: get through the shift, collect her pay, and go home to check on her mother. She worked as a waitress for an events company that handled private parties for the city's wealthiest families, and tonight's event was the engagement celebration for Adrian Blackwood, the young and celebrated chief executive of Blackwood Technologies, and his girlfriend, Camille Voss. Danny had catered dozens of parties like this one. She knew how to carry a tray of drinks through a crowded room without spilling a drop, how to smile politely at rude comments, and how to disappear into the background so the guests could enjoy their evening without noticing the people serving them. She was good at her job. She had been doing it for 6 years, ever since she left nursing school to take care of her mother, who had been diagnosed with a heart condition that required constant medication and regular hospital visits. Danny's father had passed away when she was 19, and since then, it had been just the two of them, mother and daughter, leaning on each other through every hard season. The waitressing job did not pay much, but combined with her weekend shifts at a bakery, it was enough to keep her mother's medicine paid for, and the small apartment they shared warm through the winter. What nobody at the party knew, what nobody in Danny's daily life knew, except for a handful of trusted people, was that Danny was also married. Her husband's name was Vittorio Castellano, and he was not an ordinary man. He ran one of the most powerful and feared organizations in the country, a network of business and influence that stretched into places most people never imagined. Vittorio had fallen in love with Danny 3 years earlier, not because of her name or her money, since she had neither, but because of the way she laughed with her whole body and the way she treated every person, no matter how small their job, with the same kindness. Vittorio had asked her, on the night he proposed, if she wanted to leave her old life behind and move into the world he controlled, a world of guarded mansions and private drivers and constant protection. Danny had said no. She loved him, but she did not want to lose herself. She wanted to keep working, keep laughing with her coworkers, keep visiting her mother's small kitchen on Sunday afternoons, and cooking together like nothing had changed. Vittorio had respected that wish, though it had cost him more sleepless nights than he ever admitted to her. He kept a careful watch over her from a distance. Quiet men who made sure she was never truly alone, but he never let his world touch hers. Not until tonight. The trouble had started 20 minutes before the dress tore, when Danny was carrying a tray of drinks past the head table. Camille had been drinking since the party began, celebrating loudly, laughing at her own jokes, and demanding attention from every corner of the room. When she noticed Adrian glance toward Danny as she passed, just a normal glance, the kind anyone gives to a person walking by, Camille's face changed in an instant. She stood up from her chair, swaying slightly, and marched toward Danny with narrowed eyes. "Were you smiling at my fiancé?" Camille asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the music. Danny, startled, shook her head. "No, ma'am. I was just serving drinks." "Don't lie to me." Camille's voice rose higher, drawing eyes from nearby tables. "I saw you. I saw the way you looked at him. Do you think because you're wearing a uniform that gives you the right to flirt with my man?" The accusation was absurd, and Danny knew it, but she also knew better than to argue with a guest, especially one who was clearly drunk and clearly enjoying the attention she was pulling toward herself. Danny lowered her eyes, the way she had been trained to do in situations like this, and offered a quiet apology, even though she had done nothing wrong. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way. It won't happen again." But the apology only made Camille angrier. To her, the calm response felt like disrespect, as though Danny did not think she was worth fighting with. Camille's eyes traveled down Danny's body, taking in her curves, her round face, the fullness that Danny had spent years learning to love, despite a world that constantly told her she should be smaller. A cruel smile spread across Camille's lips. "Look at you," Camille said, loud enough for the tables around them to hear. You really thought a man like Adrian would ever look twice at someone like you? Someone your size, serving drinks in a uniform 2 sizes too tight? You should be grateful anyone lets you work in a place like this." Laughter rippled through a small cluster of Camille's friends who had gathered to watch. Danny felt her face burn, but she kept her composure, setting the tray down carefully on a nearby table so her shaking hands would not drop it. She had faced cruelty before. She had learned, painfully, how to breathe through it and keep moving. But Camille was not finished. "Actually," Camille said, pulling out her phone and turning the camera toward Danny, "let's show everyone what desperate looks like." That was when Danny tried to step back, tried to put distance between herself and the woman who was clearly determined to turn this into a spectacle. But Camille moved fast, grabbing the back of Danny's dress as she turned, and pulled. The seam gave way instantly, the cheap uniform fabric no match for Camille's grip and fury, and it tore straight down the back, exposing Danny's shoulders and the strap of her undergarment to the entire ballroom. The gasp that followed was almost louder than the tear itself. Danny spun around, clutching the torn fabric against her chest, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked up and found dozens of eyes on her, some shocked, some amused, a few already lifting their phones to record. In the front of the crowd stood Adrian Blackwood, the man whose engagement they were all there to celebrate, and he did nothing. He did not step forward. He did not tell Camille to stop. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between his fiancée and the humiliated woman in front of him, frozen by the fear of upsetting the woman who controlled so much of his social standing. "That's what happens," Camille said, laughing as she slid her phone back into her small clutch purse, satisfied with the footage she had captured, "when you forget your place." Danny did not cry, though the pressure behind her eyes was enormous. She had learned long ago that crying in front of people who wanted to see you break only gave them more satisfaction. Instead, she held her chin up, turned, and walked as steadily as she could toward the staff entrance at the back of the ballroom, ignoring the whispers and the occasional muffled laughter that followed her. Her manager, a nervous man named Peter, who had watched the entire scene unfold without intervening, caught up with her near the kitchen doors. "Danny, I am so sorry," he said quietly, handing her a spare jacket from the coat room to cover herself. "I should have stepped in." "It's fine," Danny said, though nothing about it was fine. Her voice trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. "I just need to go home." Peter nodded, understanding, and told her to take the rest of the night off, that he would explain it to the events company himself. Danny thanked him and slipped out through the service hallway, avoiding the main lobby where guests might still be lingering. She did not want anyone else to see her like this, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, her uniform torn beneath it, her pride shredded along with the fabric. What Danny did not know, as she walked briskly through the hallway toward the staff exit, was that one of the guests at that party had recognized her the moment Camille grabbed her dress. His name was Marco, and he had worked for Vittorio for nearly a decade. A quiet man who attended events like this one, specifically to keep a watchful eye on people connected to powerful families, gathering information that Vittorio found useful for his business dealings. Marco had met Danny only twice before, both times at small, private family gatherings where Vittorio had allowed his two worlds to briefly touch, but he remembered her face clearly. The moment he saw the dress tear and recognized who stood beneath the torn fabric, his blood went cold. Marco did not react outwardly. He kept his expression neutral, the way he had been trained to do in every situation, no matter how alarming. He watched Camille laugh, watched Adrian stand frozen, watched the small crowd of guests who found the humiliation entertaining rather than horrifying. Then he calmly excused himself from his table, walked to a quiet corner of the ballroom near the tall windows, and pulled out his phone. His hands, usually steady after years of controlled work, trembled slightly as he dialed a number he rarely needed to use directly. It rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Marco, this better be important." "Sir," Marco said quietly, keeping his back to the room, his voice low enough that no one nearby could hear him. "It's about your wife." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause that felt heavier than silence should. What happened? It was not a question. It was a demand, spoken with the kind of quiet control that Marco had learned over years of service, was far more dangerous than shouting. Marco explained what he had witnessed, keeping his voice steady, even as his stomach twisted with the knowledge of what this call would set into motion. He described the accusation, the cruel words about Danny's appearance, the torn dress, the laughing guests, and the man who had done nothing to stop it despite standing close enough to intervene. He gave the names, Camille Voss and Adrian Blackwood, and the location, the Grandeur Hotel, along with the exact time it had happened. The silence that followed Marco's report stretched long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. Then Vittorio spoke again, and his voice had changed completely. It was quieter now, almost gentle, but underneath that quiet was something that made even a man as experienced as Marco feel a chill run down his spine. "Is she hurt?" "No, sir. Not physically. She left the venue on her own. She seemed shaken but composed." "Where is she now?" "She just exited through the staff entrance. I believe she's heading to her car." "Stay where you are. Watch the two of them. Do not approach anyone. Do not let anyone see you paying attention. I want to know everything. Who else was involved? Who laughed? Who filmed it?" "Everything." "Yes, sir." The line went dead. Marco slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket and turned back toward the ballroom, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been all evening, though inside, he understood exactly what had just happened. Somewhere in a room he could not see, Vittorio Castellano, a man whose name alone was enough to end careers and businesses with a single phone call, had just learned that his wife had been humiliated in public by people who had no idea who she truly was. Danny, meanwhile, sat in her car in the hotel's parking garage, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, finally allowing herself to breathe. She did not start the engine right away. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, at the borrowed jacket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, at the redness in her eyes that she had refused to let turn into tears in front of anyone else. She thought about calling Vittorio, telling him what had happened, letting him hold her the way he always did when the world felt unkind. But something stopped her. Shame. A quiet, stubborn shame that told her if she called him now, if she let him see her this way, defeated and humiliated by a woman who thought she was worthless, it would confirm every insecurity she carried about not fitting into his world. Vittorio moved through circles of power and elegance every day. His wife had just been mocked publicly for her size, for her job, for daring to exist in the same room as people who considered themselves above her. She did not want him to see that. She did not want him to look at her differently. So instead of calling him, Danny wiped her eyes, took a slow breath, and started the car. She would go home, check on her mother, change out of the ruined uniform, and decide later how much of tonight she would ever tell her husband. She had no way of knowing that the decision had already been taken out of her hands, that somewhere across the city, a man who loved her more than anything in the world had just learned every detail of what happened to her, and that the quiet, careful life she had built for herself was about to change forever. As she pulled out of the parking garage and onto the busy street, her phone buzzed once in her purse. She glanced at it briefly, saw an unfamiliar number, and let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a wrong number or a work call she was too tired to answer tonight. She had no idea that the call had come from one of Vittorio's men, dispatched the moment Marco's report reached him, sent to quietly confirm that Donnie had made it to her car safely. She had no idea that from this point forward, she would never truly be alone again, watched not with suspicion, but with a fierce and growing fury on her behalf, a fury that was only beginning to build. Behind her, back inside the Grandeur Hotel, the party continued as if nothing had happened. Camille laughed with her friends near the bar, showing off the video she had captured on her phone, replaying the moment the dress tore for anyone who wanted to see it, delighting in the attention it brought her. Adrian stood nearby, quieter than usual, glancing occasionally toward the staff entrance where the waitress had disappeared, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach that he could not quite explain. He told himself it was nothing, that Camille had just been having fun, that the woman would forget about it by morning and move on with her life the way people like her always did. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had no idea that the woman who had just been humiliated in front of 200 guests was married to a man capable of ending everything he had built with a single decision. He had no idea that the fury, already stirring across the city, quiet and controlled, and utterly relentless, would soon arrive at his own front door. For now, the party continued, the music played, and the champagne flowed. But somewhere in the city, a phone call had already set something in motion that could not be stopped, and by morning, nothing about this night would feel like a small, forgettable incident to anyone involved. Danny drove home through quiet streets, past closed shops and dim streetlights, her mind replaying the scene over and over, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. She kept hearing Camille's voice, the cruel edge of it, the way the words had landed so precisely on every insecurity Danny had spent years trying to bury. She had built a life for herself out of quiet dignity, choosing every day to hold her head high, even when the world seemed determined to remind her that she did not fit its narrow idea of what a woman should look like. Tonight had cracked something in that armor, and she was not sure yet how deep the crack went. When she reached her mother's apartment, she sat outside in the car for several minutes, composing herself, forcing her breathing to slow and her hands to stop trembling before she went inside. Her mother, Elena, was already asleep in her chair by the window, a half-finished cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, the television playing quietly in the background. Danny turned it off gently, careful not to wake her, and pulled a blanket over her mother's shoulders before slipping into her own small room down the hall. She changed out of the ruined uniform, folding it carefully, even though she knew she would likely throw it away in the morning, and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. Vittorio had sent a simple message an hour earlier, asking how the event had gone, telling her he loved her and would see her soon. She typed 3 different replies and deleted each one, unable to find words that felt honest without revealing how shaken she truly was. Finally, she settled on a short response, telling him the night had been long and that she was tired, promising to call him tomorrow. She did not mention the dress. She did not mention Camille's words. She told herself it was because she did not want to worry him, though somewhere underneath that reasoning was the quiet fear that even the man who loved her without condition might, for one unguarded moment, see her the way that ballroom full of strangers had seen her tonight. She turned off her lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment settling around her, and told herself that tomorrow would feel different, that the sharp edges of tonight's humiliation would soften with sleep and distance. She had no way of knowing that while she drifted toward an uneasy rest, a very different kind of night was only beginning across the city, one that would ensure nothing about tomorrow would feel ordinary again. Vittorio Castellano stood at the window of his study, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city lights while Marco's voice replayed in his mind for the 100th time. Is she hurt? No, sir. Not physically. The words offered no comfort. He had built his entire life around the promise that no one would ever touch her, ever humiliate her, ever make her feel small, and tonight, while he sat in this house believing she was simply working a shift like any other night, a room full of strangers had torn that promise apart along with her dress. He set the glass down without drinking from it and turned to the 2 men waiting quietly near the door of his study. Both had served him for years. Both understood that when Vittorio's voice dropped this low and this calm, it meant something serious was coming. Bring me everything on Camille Voss, he said. Family, business connections, finances, friendships, everything she has ever touched. And Adrian Blackwood, his company, his investors, his board, every contract Blackwood Technologies has signed in the last 5 years. Yes, sir, the taller of the 2 men said, already reaching for his phone. I want it by morning. The men left without another word, and Vittorio remained standing by the window, alone with the anger he refused to let anyone else witness. He was not a man who acted out of raw emotion. Everything he had built, every piece of influence he held, existed because he understood the value of patience, of gathering information before making a move, of never letting fury dictate his decisions. But tonight tested that discipline in a way nothing had in years. He thought of Danny the first time he met her, 3 years earlier, at a small cafe near the edge of the city, where he had gone to meet a business contact who never showed. She had been the one working the counter that day, and when his contact failed to appear, she had brought him a second coffee without being asked, told him some men were not worth waiting for, and made him laugh for the first time in longer than he could remember. He had returned to that cafe 4 more times before he worked up the nerve to ask for her name. She had no idea, in those early weeks, who he truly was, and by the time she found out, she had already decided it did not change how she felt about him. That single choice, to love him, despite what his world could offer or threaten, had meant more to him than any amount of loyalty he commanded through fear. He had promised her, on their wedding day, that she would never have to become someone she was not, that she could keep her job, her friendships, her ordinary Tuesday mornings at the bakery down the street from her mother's apartment. He had kept that promise for 3 years, watching from a careful distance, making sure danger never found her, believing that as long as he stayed in the shadows, she would remain safe in the light. Tonight had proven him wrong, and the failure sat heavy in his chest, heavier than any business loss or betrayal he had faced in 15 years of building his empire. His phone buzzed on the desk. Marco again, this time sending photographs quietly gathered from other guests' social media posts before the accounts could be made private. Images of Camille laughing, of the torn dress, of Danny's face caught in a moment of shock before she composed herself. Vittorio looked at each photograph slowly, deliberately, forcing himself to see every detail, rather than looking away from the pain in his wife's eyes. When he reached the last image, one that showed Adrian standing only a few feet away, watching and doing nothing, something inside Vittorio's chest went cold and still, the way it always did, right before he made a decision he would not reverse. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his desk reading the reports his men brought back over the following hours, learning everything there was to know about the 2 people who had humiliated his wife. Camille Voss came from a wealthy family whose fortune had thinned considerably over the past decade due to poor investments and a lifestyle that outpaced their remaining income. Her engagement to Adrian Blackwood was, according to several reports, less about affection and more about securing financial stability for a family sliding toward ruin. Adrian himself was the founder of a rising technology company that had recently secured a significant round of funding from investors who valued discretion and reputation above almost everything else. That detail interested Vittorio the most. A company built on investor confidence was a company vulnerable to the smallest hint of scandal. He did not need violence to make his point. He rarely did. Fear worked in many forms, and the quiet, patient kind, the kind that dismantled a person's world piece by piece without ever raising a hand, was often more effective than anything loud or dramatic. By the time morning arrived, Vittorio had a plan taking shape in his mind, though he had not yet decided how far he would let it go. He wanted to see his wife first. He needed to look at her, hold her, understand exactly how deeply the previous night had wounded her, before he decided what consequences would follow. He dressed carefully, dismissed his usual driver, and drove himself to her mother's apartment building shortly after sunrise, parking a block away out of habit, though today the caution felt unnecessary given everything already in motion. Danny answered the door still in her pajamas, surprised to see him standing there without warning, his eyes searching her face the moment she opened the door. She had not told him yet. She had spent the night convincing herself she would find the right words eventually, perhaps over the weekend, perhaps never at all if she could manage to forget it herself. But standing in front of him now, seeing the careful way he studied her, she understood immediately that he already knew. "You heard," she said quietly, stepping back to let him inside. "I heard everything," he said, closing the door gently behind him. "Why didn't you call me?" Her eyes filled with tears she had refused to let fall the night before, and she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed all over again, despite being fully dressed in her own home. "Because I didn't want you to see me like that, weak, humiliated in front of people who think women like me don't deserve respect." Vittorio crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he had wanted to since the moment Marco's call ended the night before. "You are the strongest person I know," he said against her hair. "Nothing about what happened to you was weakness. It was cruelty, and it came from people who will understand very soon exactly what they have done." Danny pulled back slightly, searching his face with sudden worry. "Vittorio, please, don't do anything that puts you at risk. I don't need revenge. I just need to move past it." "This isn't only about you," he said gently. though his voice carried an edge she rarely heard directed at anyone but his enemies. "You are my wife. In my world, what happened to you last night is not simply an insult to you. It is a message to everyone watching that I cannot protect the person I love most. I cannot let that message stand, not for my sake, and not for yours." She understood, in that moment, the impossible position he occupied, torn between the ordinary life he had promised her and the world he governed. A world with rules she had never fully understood despite 3 years of marriage. She did not want anyone hurt. She had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, choosing kindness even toward people who did not deserve it, and the thought of her husband using his power to destroy 2 people, however cruel they had been, unsettled her deeply. "Promise me," she said, holding his face in her hands, "that whatever you do, it stays within reason. No violence. I mean it, Vittorio. I could not live with myself if something happened to them because of me." He studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect her completely and his respect for the values she had always held on to, values he had come to love as much as everything else about her. Finally he nodded. "No violence," he agreed. "But they will lose everything they built on cruelty. I promise you that instead." Across the city, in the penthouse office of Blackwood Technologies, Adrian Blackwood arrived earlier than usual, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that had followed him home from the party the night before. He told himself repeatedly that nothing was wrong, that Camille had simply had too much to drink and made a scene that would blow over by the end of the week. But something about the way that waitress had looked at him in the final second before she turned and walked away, not angry, not even particularly surprised, simply resigned, as if she had expected exactly this kind of treatment from people like him, stayed lodged in his mind like a splinter he could not remove. His assistant, a quiet young woman named Grace, knocked on his office door mid-morning with a worried expression. "Mr. Blackwood, 2 of our investors called within the last hour. Both wanted to reschedule next week's meetings." "Did they say why?" "No, sir. Just that their calendars had changed." Adrian felt a small knot form in his stomach, though he pushed it aside, telling himself, investor schedules changed all the time, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He thanked Grace and returned to his work, unaware that across town, in a quiet office with no name on the door, a very different kind of meeting had already begun, one that would determine exactly how many more of his calendar appointments would suddenly and mysteriously disappear over the coming days. Camille, meanwhile, spent her morning at a spa with 2 friends, replaying the video from the previous night for anyone who asked, still laughing at the memory of the waitress's shocked face, completely unaware that somewhere across the city, a man she had never met and would never have imagined existed was reading a file with her name on it, a file that contained every financial account, every family secret, every fragile piece of the reputation she had spent her entire life constructing. She had no idea that her world, built so carefully on appearances and inherited wealth, was standing on ground that had already begun, quietly and invisibly, to shift beneath her feet. Back at Danny's mother's apartment, Vittorio stayed longer than he had planned, sitting at the small kitchen table while Elena, who had woken to find him there, insisted on making tea for all 3 of them, despite Danny's protests that her mother should rest. Elena had always liked Vittorio, not for his wealth or his influence, which she rarely thought about, but for the way his entire posture softened whenever he looked at her daughter, a softness that reminded her of Donnie's late father. She noticed immediately that something was wrong, the tightness around her daughter's eyes, the careful way Vittorio kept glancing at Danny as though checking that she was still steady on her feet. "Something happened," Elena said simply, setting 3 cups of tea on the table and lowering herself into the chair across from them. It was not a question. Danny hesitated, but her mother's steady gaze left no room for avoidance, so she told her, quietly and without embellishment, what had happened at the Grandeur Hotel the night before. Elena listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped tightly around her teacup, and when Danny finished, her mother's eyes had turned glassy, with a mixture of heartbreak and fury that surprised even Vittorio, who had never seen the gentle older woman look quite so fierce. "That woman tore your dress in front of 200 people," Elena said slowly, "and called you unworthy because of your size, in a room full of people eating food you helped prepare. wearing clothes you helped pay for with money you earned honestly. And the man standing beside her did nothing. Mom, please, I don't want this to become a bigger thing than it already is. It is already a big thing, Elena said firmly. The only question is whether the people responsible will ever understand that. Vittorio said nothing, but the look he exchanged with Elena in that moment carried an understanding that needed no words. Elena had always known, in the vague way that mothers often know things without being told directly, that her son-in-law's world extended far beyond what he shared with her daughter. She had never asked questions, had never wanted the details, but she trusted him completely with her daughter's safety. And in this moment, watching the barely restrained tension in his jaw, she found herself grateful rather than frightened by whatever quiet storm was building behind his calm expression. Before he left that morning, Vittorio knelt beside Danny's chair and took both of her hands in his. I need you to trust me, he said. Not to hurt anyone, just to make sure something like this never happens to you again, and that the people who did this understand exactly what they took from you was never yours to lose. Danny studied his face for a long moment, searching for the anger she knew he was carefully containing, and found instead something closer to grief, as though her humiliation had wounded him as deeply as it had wounded her. She nodded slowly. Just promise me you'll stay careful. I don't want to lose you over people who aren't worth either of our energy. You won't lose me, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I promise you that. He left shortly after, driving back across the city with a clarity of purpose that had been missing since the previous night's phone call. By the time he reached his office, the two men he had assigned to gather information were waiting with thick folders spread across his desk, documents detailing every layer of Camille Voss's crumbling family finances and every investor connected to Adrian Blackwood's technology company. Vittorio read through the material methodically, marking pages, cross-referencing names, building a picture in his mind of exactly where pressure could be applied without a single act of violence required. He thought again of his promise to Danny. No harm, no blood, just consequences, delivered patiently and precisely, the kind that would take everything Camille and Adrian valued and let it slip through their fingers, the same way Danny's dignity had been stripped from her in front of a laughing crowd. It felt, to Vittorio, like the only form of justice that honored both his fury and his wife's insistence on mercy. By early afternoon, he had made 3 phone calls, each brief, each delivered in the calm, unhurried tone that his associates had learned over the years meant business was about to change hands. He did not mention Camille or Adrian by name in any of the calls. He simply reminded old friends and business partners, men who owed him favors accumulated over many years, that certain investments currently tied to Blackwood Technologies might benefit from a period of reconsideration. Nothing threatening, nothing that could be traced back to malice. Just quiet, deliberate suggestion, the kind that men in Vittorio's world understood immediately and acted upon without ever needing to ask why. By the time evening arrived, 2 more investors had reached out to Adrian's office, requesting rescheduled meetings, and a whisper had begun moving through certain financial circles that Blackwood Technologies might not be the safe, stable investment it had appeared to be only a week earlier. Adrian felt the shift without understanding its source, a growing unease settling over his day that no amount of reassurance from his own team could fully dispel. Something was happening around him, invisible but undeniable, and though he could not yet name it, he could feel its weight pressing steadily closer. That night, Camille returned to Adrian's penthouse in high spirits, still riding the satisfaction of the attention her video had gathered online, unaware of the quiet unraveling already taking place around the man she planned to marry. She found him staring out the window instead of greeting her at the door, a glass of wine untouched on the side table beside him. "You've been strange all day," she said, dropping her bag onto the couch. "Is something wrong?" "2 more investors postponed our meetings," Adrian said without turning around. "That's 4 this week. I don't understand what's happening." Camille waved a dismissive hand, settling onto the couch and reaching for the remote. "Investors are always canceling things. You worry too much. Come sit down. I want to watch something." Adrian did not move from the window. Somewhere beneath his usual confidence, a quiet instinct was beginning to stir, the kind that told him this was not simple coincidence. though he had no way yet of understanding just how far the consequences of the previous night would reach, or how quickly the foundation beneath both of their lives was about to give way entirely. By Thursday morning, 6 investors had withdrawn from Blackwood Technologies, and Adrian stood in his office, staring at a spreadsheet that made his stomach turn. Numbers that had looked strong just 5 days earlier now told a story of collapse, happening faster than he could explain to his board, faster than any market shift or industry trend could justify. Something targeted was happening to his company, and he was beginning to understand, with a dread he could not fully name, that it had started the same night his fiancée tore a waitress's dress in front of 200 witnesses. His chief financial officer, a steady man named Nathan, who rarely raised his voice, sat across from him with his own copy of the numbers spread out between them. "I've been in this industry 18 years, Nathan said. "I have never seen 6 investors pull back in the same week without a single public reason. This isn't market behavior, Adrian. Someone is making calls." "Who would do that?" Nathan shook his head slowly. "That's what worries me. Whoever it is, they have enough influence to move 6 separate investment groups without leaving fingerprints. That kind of reach isn't ordinary." Adrian's mind flashed back to the party, to the waitress's quiet composure as she walked away from the humiliation Camille had inflicted on her, and to the strange, uneasy feeling that had followed him home that night. He dismissed the thought immediately, telling himself it was impossible, that a hotel waitress could not possibly have connections capable of shaking an entire investment portfolio. But the timing gnawed at him, and by the end of the day, unable to focus on anything else, he decided to quietly look into who exactly had been serving at his engagement party. He called Peter, the events manager who had handled the party's staffing, under the pretense of following up about a lost item from the evening. After a few minutes of small talk, Adrian steered the conversation carefully. "There was a waitress that night. The one who had some kind of incident with my fiancé. Do you happen to know her name?" Peter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing an employee's private information, but Adrian's position as the client made it difficult to refuse outright. "Her name is Dani. She's worked with our company for years. Reliable, quiet, never causes trouble. What happened that night wasn't her fault, sir, if you don't mind me saying so." "I understand," Adrian said. "I just wanted to make sure she was all right." He ended the call feeling no closer to an answer, but something about the ordinariness of Peter's description, reliable, quiet, never causes trouble, made the growing catastrophe around his company feel even more confusing. If she truly was just an ordinary waitress, then who was moving against him with such precision, and why had it started the exact night of her humiliation? Camille, for her part, remained oblivious to the mounting crisis surrounding Adrian's business, far more consumed with the attention her video continued to receive online. It had been shared widely within her social circle, and though a small number of people had commented with concern for the woman in the footage, most of the responses praised Camille for putting someone in their place, feeding the sense of superiority she had carried her entire life. She posted a follow-up video that evening, laughing about the incident with 2 of her closest friends, describing Dani in cruel, dismissive terms that made her friends laugh along with her, none of them aware that the video was quietly being screenshotted and forwarded through channels far removed from Camille's usual audience. One of those screenshots reached Vittorio within hours, and though his expression remained calm as he reviewed it at his desk, something in his eyes hardened in a way that made the men standing nearby instinctively lower their voices. He had promised Dani no violence, and he intended to keep that promise, but watching Camille mock his wife again, this time with practiced cruelty rather than drunken impulse, told him something important. This was not a woman capable of remorse. Whatever consequences arrived, she would not understand them as justice. She would only understand them as loss, and loss, delivered precisely and completely, was exactly what Vittorio intended to deliver. He made 2 more calls that afternoon. The first was to a contact within Camille's family's remaining financial holdings, a small but critical investment fund that had, for years, quietly propped up what remained of the Voss family fortune after a string of bad decisions decades earlier. Vittorio's contact confirmed what his research had already suggested, that the fund was more fragile than public appearances suggested, dependent on a handful of large depositors who trusted the fund's management out of old family loyalty, rather than current performance. A few well-placed doubts whispered into the right ears would be enough to begin a slow withdrawal that the fund could not survive. The second call was to a journalist Vittorio had helped years earlier, quietly, in a matter involving a story that could have destroyed an innocent family had it been published without context. The journalist owed him a debt she had never forgotten, and though Vittorio rarely called in favors of this kind, he judged this the right moment. He did not ask her to fabricate anything. He simply suggested she look into recent complaints filed against Blackwood Technologies regarding workplace culture and investor transparency, complaints that, as it happened, several disgruntled former employees had been more than willing to discuss once someone finally asked. By Friday, a short but pointed article appeared in a respected business publication, questioning Blackwood Technologies' sudden loss of investor confidence and citing anonymous sources within the company who described a culture of instability at the top. The article did not mention Camille or the engagement party directly, but it painted a picture of a company and its leadership under quiet strain, exactly the kind of story that made cautious investors even more cautious. Adrian read the article at his desk, with his hands trembling slightly, the careful, professional language somehow more devastating than any direct accusation could have been. He called an emergency meeting with his board that afternoon, watching the concern on their faces as they discussed damage control, watching the same investors who had once praised his vision, now speaking in careful, hedged terms about reassessing their commitments. For the first time since founding his company, Adrian felt the ground beneath him truly shifting, and though he still could not fully explain why, he found himself thinking again and again about the woman whose dress had been torn in front of him, about the way he had stood frozen instead of stepping forward to help her. That evening, alone in his office long after his staff had gone home, Adrian finally allowed himself to admit what he had been avoiding all week. He had let Camille humiliate an innocent woman in front of a room full of people, and he had done nothing, said nothing, offered no comfort or apology. He did not yet understand the full connection between that moment and the collapse currently unfolding around his company, but some instinct deep inside him insisted the two were connected, and that instinct refused to be silenced, no matter how illogical it seemed on the surface. He drafted a message to Camille that night, asking her to take down the video and stop discussing the incident publicly, worried that continued attention might make an already difficult situation worse. Camille responded within minutes, dismissive and irritated. "It's just a video, Adrian. People will move on in a few days. Stop being so dramatic about it. 6 investors have pulled out this week," he typed back. "I don't think this is unrelated." There was a long pause before her reply came through. "You cannot possibly believe some waitress has anything to do with your business problems. That's ridiculous." Adrian stared at the message for a long time before responding, uncertain himself whether the connection he suspected was real or simply the product of a stressed and sleepless mind searching for explanations. But something about Camille's easy dismissal, her refusal to even consider the possibility, unsettled him more than the losses themselves. He set his phone down without replying and sat alone in the darkening office, watching the city lights outside his window, wondering for the first time whether the woman he had planned to marry was someone he truly understood at all. Across the city, Danny had spent the week trying to return to normal life, taking a few days off from her waitressing job at her mother's insistence while the emotional weight of the incident settled. She had not seen the article about Blackwood Technologies, had no idea that her husband's quiet campaign was already reshaping the lives of the people who had humiliated her, and continued her days largely unaware of the storm gathering around Camille and Adrian. Vittorio, careful to honor his promise about avoiding violence, chose not to burden her with the details of what he was doing, wanting to spare her the guilt she would likely feel at the scale of consequences already unfolding, even though every consequence remained, by his own careful design, entirely without physical harm. He visited her each evening that week, bringing her favorite meals from a small restaurant near their first cafe, sitting with her on the small balcony of her mother's apartment as the sun set over the city, talking about anything except the party, giving her the space to heal at her own pace, rather than pushing her toward a resolution she was not ready for. Danny noticed a quiet intensity in him that week, a focus she recognized from times before when his work required his full attention, but she chose not to ask questions, trusting the promise he had made her, and grateful, more than she could express, for the steady comfort of his presence during a week that had otherwise left her feeling fragile and exposed. While Adrian sat awake in his office, questioning everything he thought he understood about his fiancée, Camille's mother, a proud and image-conscious woman named Helena, called her daughter in a state of quiet panic. The family's investment fund manager had contacted her that afternoon with unsettling news. Several long-standing depositors had requested meetings to discuss withdrawing their holdings, an unusual and unwelcome development for a fund that had remained stable for over a decade. "What's happening with the fund?" Camille asked, more irritated than concerned, assuming her mother's worry was, as usual, exaggerated. "I don't know," Helena said, her voice tighter than Camille had heard in years. "But 3 families who have trusted us for 20 years are suddenly asking questions about our management, questions they have never asked before. Has something happened, Camille? Anything at all that could be connected to this?" Camille thought immediately of the video, of Adrian's warnings that she had dismissed so easily, but pride kept her from voicing the connection aloud, even to her own mother. "Of course not," she said instead. "It's probably just people being paranoid about the economy. It'll pass." Helena did not sound convinced, but she let the subject drop, promising to keep Camille updated as the situation developed. After the call ended, Camille sat alone in Adrian's penthouse, staring at her phone, a small seed of doubt finally taking root despite her efforts to dismiss it. She scrolled back through the video she had posted, the laughing comments beneath it, the countless shares that had made her feel powerful and admired only days earlier. For the first time, she noticed a handful of comments she had previously ignored, strangers condemning her cruelty, calling the video disturbing rather than entertaining. She closed the app quickly, unwilling to sit with the discomfort those comments stirred in her, and told herself once again that everything happening around her was simply unfortunate coincidence. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Technologies, the board meeting Adrian had called stretched late into the evening, tense and increasingly difficult, as members raised concerns he struggled to answer. One board member, an older woman named Claire who had supported Adrian since the company's earliest days, pulled him aside after the meeting ended. "Adrian, I have known you for 6 years," she said quietly. "I have never seen investors behave this way. All at once, all without explanation. Something is happening that you are not telling us, or something is happening that you do not yet understand yourself. Either way, you need to find out before this company loses more than it can recover from." "I don't know what's causing this," Adrian admitted, the honesty costing him more than he expected. "I've asked myself the same question every day this week." Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "Then find the answer quickly. Companies survive market downturns. They rarely survive mystery." Her words stayed with him long after she left, echoing through the quiet office as he sat alone once again, staring at the article on his screen, at the anonymous complaints it referenced, at the slow but unmistakable unraveling of everything he had spent years building. He thought again of the waitress, of her calm, unshaken dignity, even in the face of public humiliation, and for reasons he still could not fully articulate, he found himself wishing he had done something that night. Anything, rather than standing frozen while Camille tore apart a stranger's evening for the sake of her own wounded pride. He did not yet know her married name. He did not yet know the truth that would soon reshape everything he understood about the events of that night, about the fragile empire he had built, and about the woman he had chosen to marry. But some quiet instinct told him the answer was close, closer than he was ready for, and that whatever it turned out to be, his life was never going to look the same again once he learned it. On Saturday morning, unable to shake his unease, Adrian drove to the Grandeur Hotel and asked to speak with Peter directly, hoping a face-to-face conversation might reveal something a phone call had not. Peter met him in a quiet corner of the empty ballroom, the same room that had held 200 guests only a week earlier, now silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. "I need to understand something," Adrian said carefully. "The woman from that night, Danny. Is there anything unusual about her, anything at all, that I should know?" Peter's expression grew guarded, and for a moment, Adrian thought he would refuse to answer entirely. "She's a good employee," Peter finally said. "Quiet about her personal life. Keeps to herself. I've heard rumors over the years, Nothing confirmed, about who her husband might be, but I've never asked, and she's never offered. Some things are better left alone, Mr. Blackwood. I'd suggest you leave it alone too. The warning in Peter's voice was unmistakable, and Adrian left the hotel that afternoon with more questions than answers, a growing sense of dread settling permanently into his chest. He did not yet have a name to attach to his fear, but he understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whoever Danny's husband was, the man possessed exactly the kind of quiet, far-reaching power capable of dismantling a company piece by piece without ever announcing his presence, and that Adrian himself, along with everyone connected to that fateful engagement party, stood directly in the path of a reckoning that had already begun. The black car arrived outside Blackwood Technologies at exactly 9 in the morning, and Adrian knew, the instant he saw it from his office window, that whatever had been circling his company all week had finally decided to reveal itself. 2 men stepped out first, scanning the entrance with quiet efficiency, before a third man emerged, tall and composed, wearing a dark coat that seemed to command the sidewalk around him without any visible effort. Adrian's assistant, Grace, buzzed his office moments later, her voice tight with nerves. "Mr. Blackwood, there's a man here asking to see you. He says his name is Vittorio Castellano. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says you'll want to make time for him." Adrian's stomach dropped. He had heard the name before, whispered occasionally in business circles with a mixture of respect and fear, always in reference to deals that fell apart mysteriously, or fortunes that changed hands without public explanation. He had never met the man, had never had reason to cross paths with him, and the sudden appearance of that name at his office door confirmed every fear that had been building in him for days. "Send him in," Adrian said, forcing steadiness into his voice that he did not fully feel. Vittorio entered alone, closing the office door quietly behind him, and took the seat across from Adrian's desk, without waiting to be invited. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying Adrian with an expression that gave away none of the fury he had carried for the past week, only a calm, patient attention that felt somehow more unsettling than open anger would have. "You know why I'm here," Vittorio said finally. Adrian's throat tightened. "I have some idea, but I'd like to hear it from you directly. A week ago, a woman was humiliated at a party in this city. Her dress was torn in front of 200 people. She was mocked for her appearance, filmed without her consent, and left to walk out of that room alone, while the man standing closest to her did absolutely nothing to help." Vittorio's voice remained level throughout, though each word landed with the weight of something far heavier than volume could convey. "That woman is my wife." The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face, as the pieces he had been trying to assemble all week finally clicked into place with devastating clarity. The waitress, Danny. The quiet, composed woman who had absorbed Camille's cruelty without a single word of protest, who Peter had warned him not to investigate further, was married to one of the most powerful and feared men in the country, and Adrian had stood 3 feet away and watched her be humiliated without lifting a finger to stop it. "I didn't know," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, I had no idea who she was." "That's precisely the problem," Vittorio said. "You didn't need to know who she was to do the right thing. You needed only to see a person being cruelly mistreated in front of you and choose, as any decent man would, to intervene. You chose silence instead. You chose to protect your own comfort over her dignity." Adrian had no response to offer, because he understood, with painful clarity, that everything Vittorio said was true. He had stood frozen that night not because he lacked the ability to act, but because he had feared upsetting Camille more than he had valued protecting a stranger from humiliation, and no justification he could offer now would change that fundamental truth. "I know about the investors," Adrian said quietly. "I know you're behind what's happening to my company." "I am," Vittorio confirmed without hesitation or apology. "And I promised my wife I would not resort to violence. A promise I have kept and will continue to keep. But I made no promise about your business, your reputation, or your future. Those, Mr. Blackwood, are entirely within my reach, and I intend to use every piece of that reach until the world understands exactly what happens to people who allow cruelty to happen in front of them without consequence. "What do you want from me?" Adrian asked, desperation creeping into his voice despite his effort to remain composed. Vittorio studied him for a long moment before answering. "I want you to understand what you allowed to happen. Beyond that, what happens next depends entirely on how you choose to act in the coming days. I am not interested in destroying an innocent man's life over a single moment of cowardice, but I am equally uninterested in protecting a man who continues to align himself with cruelty rather than confronting it." He stood then, straightening his coat, and walked toward the door before pausing with his hand on the handle. "Camille Voss will not receive the same consideration I am extending to you. She showed no remorse when given the chance. She mocked my wife again after the fact, laughing with friends over a video she should have deleted out of basic human decency. Whatever happens to her from this point forward, she has earned entirely on her own." Vittorio left without another word, and Adrian sat alone in his office for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the closed door, his mind racing through every possible path forward. He thought of Camille, of the woman he had planned to marry, of the casual cruelty he had witnessed in her that night, and had chosen to excuse rather than confront. He thought of his company, built from nothing over 6 exhausting years, now teetering on the edge of collapse because of a decision that had taken less than 30 seconds to make and had cost him everything in the days since. By early afternoon, Adrian had made his decision. He called an emergency press conference, gathering the small group of journalists who still covered his company closely, and stood before them with a statement he had drafted himself, rejecting the careful, lawyer-approved language his communications team had prepared. "Last week, at my own engagement celebration, a member of the event staff was publicly humiliated by my fiancée," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to admit. "Her dress was torn, she was mocked for her appearance, and I stood by and did nothing to stop it. That silence was a failure of character on my part, and I take full responsibility for it. I have ended my engagement to Camille Voss effective immediately, and I have committed my company to reviewing our workplace culture policies to ensure something like this is never tolerated again in any environment connected to Blackwood Technologies." The statement spread quickly, picked up by news outlets far beyond the small business publication that had first hinted at trouble within the company. Some praised Adrian's honesty, calling it a rare moment of genuine accountability from a young executive. Others criticized him for waiting a week to speak up, for only acting once his company's survival was clearly at stake rather than out of genuine conviction. Adrian accepted both reactions without argument, understanding that whatever redemption he might eventually earn would need to be built slowly, through consistent action rather than a single public statement. Camille learned about the broken engagement not from Adrian directly, but from a news alert that appeared on her phone while she sat at a cafe with friends, celebrating nothing in particular, the way she often did on quiet afternoons. She stared at the headline in disbelief, reading it 3 times before the reality of it fully registered, her face draining of color as her friends exchanged uncertain glances around the table. She called Adrian immediately, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and panic. "What is this? You ended our engagement through a press conference? You didn't even have the decency to tell me first?" "I tried to warn you, Camille," Adrian said, his voice tired but resolute. "I told you this wasn't going to simply disappear. You wouldn't listen. You're blaming me for your company's problems. This is insane. You're throwing away everything we built because some waitress got upset about a torn dress? That woman is married to a man capable of ending both of our lives as we know them, and instead of taking that seriously when I warned you, you laughed about it with your friends and posted more videos mocking her. I am not throwing anything away, Camille. I am finally admitting the truth about what happened that night, and about who I don't want to become because of it." The line went silent for a long moment before Camille spoke again, her voice smaller now, stripped of its usual confidence. "What am I supposed to do now?" "I don't know," Adrian admitted honestly, "but I think you should prepare yourself for consequences far bigger than a broken engagement." He ended the call before she could respond, leaving her sitting alone at the cafe table, her friends now watching her with open curiosity rather than the admiration she had grown accustomed to receiving. Within hours, the video she had posted a week earlier resurfaced across social media, this time accompanied by Adrian's public statement, painting an entirely different picture than the one Camille had originally intended. Comments that had once praised her for putting someone in their place now turned sharply critical, calling her cruel, entitled, and deeply out of touch, the tide of public opinion shifting with the same speed it had once shifted in her favor. That evening, Camille's mother called again, her voice trembling with barely controlled panic. The investment fund, already weakened by the withdrawals earlier in the week, had suffered a final, devastating blow when its largest remaining depositor withdrew entirely, following a quiet conversation with a business contact whose name Helena did not recognize, but whose influence she could not ignore. The fund, the foundation of whatever remained of the family's wealth and social standing, was effectively finished. "Camille, I need you to tell me the truth," Helena said, her voice breaking. "Does this have anything to do with that video? With whatever happened at that party?" Camille sat in silence for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the darkened window of Adrian's now former penthouse, finally understanding the full weight of what her cruelty had set into motion. "Yes," she whispered, "I think it does." Her mother's response was a long, exhausted silence, the kind that carried more disappointment than any words could have expressed, and Camille, for the first time in her life, found herself completely without the confidence and certainty that had carried her through every previous crisis. Whatever came next, she understood now that she would face it entirely alone, stripped of the engagement, the wealth, and the easy admiration that had defined her entire identity, replaced instead by a reckoning she had brought upon herself and had no one left to blame but herself. Late that night, unable to sleep, Camille scrolled through the wreckage of her public image, watching follower counts drop steadily across every platform she had spent years cultivating, reading comment after comment from strangers who had once admired her now calling for accountability she had no idea how to provide. She thought about calling Danny directly, some desperate part of her wanting to apologize, to undo even a small piece of the damage her cruelty had caused, but she had no way of reaching her, no number, no address, nothing but the memory of a torn dress and a face that had shown more dignity and humiliation than Camille had ever managed to show anyone in her life. She thought, too, of her own reflection in the mirror days earlier, the satisfaction she had felt filming another person's pain, and for the first time she allowed herself to sit with the full ugliness of that memory, rather than deflecting it with excuses about being misunderstood or overly emotional that night. It did not erase what she had done. Nothing could undo the moment the dress tore, or the laughter that had followed it, but somewhere in the quiet, friendless hours of that long night, something in Camille began, slowly and painfully, to shift. Meanwhile, across the city, Vittorio returned home to find Danny waiting for him on the balcony, a soft breeze moving through her hair as she watched the lights of the city flicker below. She had seen the news of Adrian's broken engagement and public statement, had pieced together enough to understand that her husband's quiet campaign had finally surfaced into the open. She did not ask him for details. She simply reached for his hand as he sat beside her, grateful that whatever storm he had unleashed, he had kept his promise, and no one had been harmed beyond the collapse of reputations built on cruelty they had chosen for themselves. "It's not over yet," Vittorio said quietly, watching the same lights she watched. "But it will be soon." Danny leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time since the party, something close to peace settling over the anger and shame she had carried all week. "I trust you," she said simply, and in that quiet trust, Vittorio found the only reward he had truly been seeking through everything he had set into motion that week. Elena called the next morning, her voice bright with something Danny had not heard from her in days, genuine relief. She had seen the news too, had read Adrian's statement over her morning tea, and though she said nothing directly about Vittorio's involvement, the warmth in her voice carried an unspoken gratitude that needed no explanation between them. "People are finally seeing what that woman really is," Elena said. "I only wish it hadn't taken all of this for the world to notice." "Some people never see it until it's forced in front of them," Danny replied, watching the morning light spread across the kitchen table where she sat. "At least now they have." She did not yet know that the coming days would bring her face to face with the two people who had humiliated her, in circumstances neither of them could have predicted, or that the final chapter of this story would ask her to decide, once and for all, whether mercy or consequence would define the way her own quiet strength was remembered by everyone who had once underestimated her. Adrian spent that same morning meeting with Nathan and Claire, mapping out a plan to rebuild what remained of investor confidence, a slow and uncertain process that would take months rather than days. Claire watched him carefully throughout the meeting, noting the change in him since the press conference, a quiet seriousness that had not been there before. "You did the right thing," Claire said, after Nathan left the room to make calls. "It won't fix everything overnight, but it was still the right thing." "It should have been the right thing a week ago, before any of this happened," Adrian said. "I keep thinking about how easy it would have been to just tell Camille to stop. One sentence. That's all it would have taken." Claire had no answer for that, because she understood, as Adrian now did, that the cost of silence rarely announced itself in the moment it mattered most. It arrived later, quietly and completely, the way it had arrived for him this week, dismantling piece by piece everything he had once taken for granted. 2 weeks after the party, Danny stood outside the Grandeur Hotel again, staring up at the same glass doors she had walked through the night her dress was torn apart in front of 200 strangers. She had not planned to return so soon, but Peter had called her that morning, apologetic and hesitant, explaining that the hotel's management wanted to speak with her personally about what had happened, and that they had asked her to come in whenever she felt ready. Vittorio had offered to come with her, but Danny had asked to do this alone, needing to prove to herself, more than to anyone else, that she could walk back into that room without flinching. The hotel's general manager, a composed woman named Sophie, greeted her personally in the lobby and led her to a private office, rather than the ballroom itself, sensing correctly that Danny would prefer to avoid the space where the humiliation had taken place. Sophie apologized sincerely for the lack of intervention that night, explaining that new training procedures were already being implemented to ensure staff felt empowered to protect guests and employees alike from similar situations in the future. She offered Danny a formal apology on behalf of the hotel, along with an invitation to return only when, and if she felt comfortable doing so. Danny listened, grateful for the sincerity in Sophie's voice, and though she appreciated the gesture, she found herself surprised by how little the apology actually mattered to her now. The anger and shame that had consumed her in the days immediately following the party had softened into something calmer, something closer to acceptance, not because the cruelty had been erased, but because she had come to understand, through the quiet strength of her mother's support and her husband's steady love, that Camille's words had never actually held the power to define her. "Thank you," Danny said simply. "I appreciate you telling me this in person." As she left the hotel that afternoon, she noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance, hands in his pockets, clearly nervous. Adrian Blackwood stood a short distance away, watching her approach with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between guilt and hope. Danny slowed her steps, unsure whether to acknowledge him or simply walk past, but something in his posture, the genuine discomfort of a man forcing himself to face a mistake he could not undo, made her pause. "Mrs. Castellano," Adrian said quietly, the name landing between them with the full weight of everything it now meant to both of them. "I know I have no right to ask for your time. I just wanted the chance to apologize directly, in person, rather than through a press statement that will never feel like enough." Danny studied him for a long moment, remembering the way he had stood frozen that night, watching without intervening, while Camille tore her dress and her dignity apart in front of an entire room. She thought of the anger she had carried for him during the days that followed, an anger that had softened over time, but had not entirely disappeared. "You had a chance to say something that night," she said finally, her voice steady. "One sentence. That's all it would have taken to stop it before it happened. Instead, you stood there and let it continue." "I know," Adrian said, unable to meet her eyes at first. "I have thought about that moment every single day since. I was afraid of upsetting Camille, afraid of the scene it might cause, and I let that fear matter more than protecting someone who deserved to be protected. There's no excuse I can offer that makes that acceptable." Danny was quiet for a long moment, watching him carefully, searching for the sincerity beneath his words. She had spent years learning to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and performative apology, a skill sharpened by a lifetime of navigating rooms full of people who rarely saw her as anything more than the person carrying their tray. What she saw in Adrian now, the exhaustion in his eyes, the honest admission of his own cowardice without excuse or deflection, felt different from anything Camille had ever offered. "I'm not interested in destroying your company," she said finally. "That was never something I asked my husband to do, and I've made my feelings about violence and unnecessary cruelty clear to him from the beginning. But I also won't pretend that what happened that night was small, or that your silence didn't hurt just as much as her cruelty did." "I understand," Adrian said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I see what I did wrong, and that I intend to spend a long time trying to become someone who wouldn't make that same mistake again." Danny nodded slowly, something in her chest loosening slightly at the honesty of his words. "Then do that," she said. "Not for me. For the next person who needs someone to speak up when it matters." She left him standing outside the hotel, walking toward her car with a lighter step than she had carried in weeks, understanding that whatever came next for Adrian Blackwood was no longer her responsibility to manage or forgive. Only her choice whether to carry his mistake as a weight of her own. She chose, in that moment, to set it down. Camille's reckoning arrived differently, without the softness of a face-to-face apology or the possibility of redemption through changed behavior. The investment fund her family had depended on for over a decade collapsed completely within the month, taking with it the social standing Camille had spent her entire life cultivating. Invitations to the parties and events that had once defined her social calendar stopped arriving. Friends who had laughed along with her cruel jokes about Danny found new circles to associate with, unwilling to remain connected to someone whose name had become synonymous, at least for now, with public cruelty and inherited privilege crumbling under its own weight. Camille reached out to Danny only once, sending a message through Peter at the hotel, asking for the chance to apologize in person the way Adrian had. Danny considered the request for several days, before declining gently but firmly, explaining through Peter that she wished Camille well, in whatever came next, but that she did not feel an in-person apology would serve either of them in any meaningful way. Some bridges, Danny had come to understand, did not need to be rebuilt in order for both people to move forward separately, and Camille's path toward genuine change, if she chose to walk it, would need to happen without an audience or immediate reward. Helena, Camille's mother, took a small apartment on the edge of the city after the family estate was sold to cover what remained of their debts, a quiet fall from the life she had always known. Camille moved in with her for several months, humbled in ways she had never imagined possible, forced for the first time to consider what her life might look like without the wealth and admiration she had always assumed would surround her indefinitely. She took a job at a small clothing boutique, folding sweaters and greeting customers with a politeness that felt foreign at first, an odd echo of the very kind of work she had once mocked so cruelly. It was there, months later, that a customer complained loudly about the store's return policy, raising her voice until other shoppers turned to stare, embarrassed on behalf of the young employee trying to explain the rules calmly. Camille recognized, with an uncomfortable jolt, the same posture she herself had taken that night at the Grandeur Hotel, the same entitled fury, directed at someone with far less power in the room. She stepped in without thinking, calmly but firmly asking the customer to lower her voice, refusing to let the moment spiral the way her own cruelty once had. It was a small moment, unnoticed by anyone except Camille herself, but it stayed with her long after the customer left, a quiet marker of how far she had traveled from the woman who had torn a stranger's dress, simply because she could. She did not attempt to contact Danny again after her request was declined, understanding, slowly and painfully, that some forms of grace could not be demanded, only earned through years of consistent change that no single apology could shortcut. Whether she would ever fully become the kind of person capable of true remorse remained uncertain, even to herself, but for the first time in her life, she found herself genuinely trying, without an audience, without the promise of reward, simply because she had finally understood what it felt like to be the one without power in the room. Adrian, meanwhile, spent the following months rebuilding Blackwood Technologies slowly and honestly, choosing transparency over the careful image management his communications team had once insisted upon. He implemented new workplace policies, that gave every employee, regardless of position, a clear and protected way to report mistreatment they witnessed or experienced. A small, but meaningful attempt to ensure the silence he had chosen that night would never again go unchallenged within his company. The investors who returned did so slowly, cautiously, but they returned, drawn less by the strength of his original vision and more by the visible integrity of a man who had publicly admitted failure and worked, day after day, to correct it. He never fully repaired the friendship, if it could even be called that, with Camille, though the two occasionally exchanged brief, civil messages in the months that followed, each acknowledging in their own way how much that single night had changed both of their lives. Neither pretended the friendship could return to what it once was, but neither carried active bitterness either. Both instead focused on the slow, private work of becoming people they could respect when they looked in the mirror each morning. 6 months later, Danny returned to work, choosing a different events company entirely, one that had reached out after hearing her story through the quiet network of hospitality workers who had watched the video circulate and had recognized her composure that night as something worth admiring rather than mocking. She continued visiting her mother every Sunday, continued laughing with her coworkers, continued living the ordinary, grounded life she had always wanted, despite everything that had happened. Vittorio never fully returned to the careful distance he had once kept between his two worlds. The events of that week had taught him that distance alone could not guarantee her safety, that love sometimes required a more visible presence rather than a hidden one. He remained careful, still protective of the life Danny wanted to live, but he no longer hid entirely in the shadows, choosing instead to walk beside her more openly, trusting that the woman who had married him for who he was, rather than what he offered, would help him find the balance between protection and freedom that both of them needed. On the 1-year anniversary of the party, Danny and Vittorio returned to the Grandeur Hotel together, not for another event, but simply for dinner in the hotel's quiet restaurant, a private choice to reclaim the space rather than avoid it forever. Sophie greeted them personally, genuinely pleased to see Danny looking so at ease within the same walls that had once witnessed her humiliation. They sat by the window overlooking the same city where Vittorio had first learned, through a single phone call, exactly how deeply he loved the woman across the table from him. "Do you regret any of it?" Danny asked him quietly, watching the lights flicker outside. "The pressure you put on them, the lives you changed." Vittorio considered the question carefully before answering, the way he considered most things that mattered to him. "I regret that it had to happen at all," he said. "I regret that anyone thought it was acceptable to treat you with anything less than the respect you deserve. But I don't regret making sure they understood the weight of what they did. Some lessons only take root when the consequences are real." Danny reached across the table and took his hand, grateful. Not for the power he wielded, but for the steady, unwavering love beneath it. The same love that had first drawn her to him in a small cafe, years before either of them understood how deeply their lives would eventually intertwine. She had walked into that ballroom a year ago as an ordinary waitress, and walked out humiliated in front of strangers who thought her size and her job made her small. She understood now, more fully than she ever had before, that she had never been small at all. She had simply been underestimated by people who mistook quiet dignity for weakness, and who had learned, in the months that followed, exactly how wrong they had been. Outside the restaurant window, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the private storms that rise and fall within them. But inside, at a small table by the glass, a woman who had once been humiliated for who she was, sat beside the man who had never once seen her as anything less than exactly enough, and together, they faced whatever came next, not as a mafia boss and his hidden wife, but simply as two people who had chosen each other, fully and without apology, long before the rest of the world ever thought to notice. Later that night, as they walked out through the same lobby where Danny had once fled in a borrowed jacket, her torn uniform hidden beneath it, she stopped for a moment near the tall windows overlooking the entrance. She thought of the version of herself who had walked out of this hotel a year earlier, shaking and humiliated, certain that the world had just confirmed every quiet fear she carried about her worth. That woman had survived the night without knowing what waited for her, without knowing that the shame she carried would eventually transform into something closer to strength, forged not by revenge, but by the steady, unwavering love of the people who refused to let her believe, even for a moment, that she was anything less than enough. Vittorio took her hand as they stepped out into the cool evening air, the city stretching wide and glittering before them, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the storms that had passed quietly through their world months earlier. Danny breathed in deeply, feeling for the first time in a long while, completely and entirely herself, no longer defined by a torn dress or a cruel woman's laughter, but by every choice she had made since, to hold her head high, to forgive where forgiveness felt right, and to walk forward into whatever came next as exactly who she had always been, strong, dignified, and finally, fully seen.